Hello everyone. We have a new exploration journey ahead of us for tonight. And I am going to begin immediately with a true story, but a surprising one. The story of a Spanish man who is still alive today, Marcos Rodriguez Pantoja. So please make yourself comfortable and off we go. In the early 1960s, there was a rumor in the mountains of Sierra Morena in the south of Spain that a man lived with wolves in the wilderness. These mountains are not very high. They form like a hilly landscape covered in vegetation, forests. They are scarcely populated by humans. And so for centuries they have been a refuge for wildlife, wild boars, wolves, red deers, eagles. They are also one of the last habitats of the Iberian lynx, an endangered species of wild cats. Sierra Morena has a strong legendary reputation in Spain. There are myths about bandits or a giant snake associated with it. This region in the 1960s was still very poor, and human presence was limited to a few villages and shepherds living with their animals, almost in isolation from society. So when rumors spread that a man had been sighted living with wolves, this was taken with a grain of salt. But sightings multiplied, to the point that the Guardia Civil, the civil guard that was in charge of law enforcement, searched for him and found him, or rather captured him, because the young man howled and tried to bite like a wolf. He had to be bound and gagged to be taken to a hospital. He was 19 and was soon identified as Marcos Rodriguez, the boy who had gone missing 11 years earlier. His father was found, and the story of his life began to emerge. His mother had died giving birth to one of his siblings when he was only 3 years old. His father remarried, and his new stepmother mistreated him. The family was very poor, and in the 1950s they settled in a village of Sierra Morena, where they dedicated themselves to the manufacture of coal with wood. When Marcos was 7, he was delivered, possibly sold, to get rid of him, to a local landowner who put him under the care of a goat shepherd. This shepherd lived in a cave, and the child was intended to become his replacement, which is why he was sent to live with him. For a few months, Marcos lived in nature with this shepherd. The two completely cut from society most of the time, until the shepherd died unexpectedly, leaving the boy alone in nature, aged 7 or 8. The rest we know only from what he would later tell. Having been mistreated his whole life, with no family to return to, Marcos stayed alone in nature and somehow survived, thanks to what he had learned and probably good adaptation skills. He found roots and wild fruits to eat. He had milk from the flock of goats, at least at the beginning, but recorded he was constantly hungry at the time. Until one day, still a young boy, maybe aged 8 or 9, he entered a cave where there were recently born wolf cubs, waiting for their mother to return. Either he was unaware of the danger or desperate, but he stayed with them. And surprisingly, when the she-wolf came back with meat, she did not attack him. She growled a bit, sniffed him, but after feeding her youngs with the meat, she seemed to accept him and gave him a piece of raw meat to eat, which he did. From this moment on, he befriended these wolves and stayed with them. With their help, he managed to survive in nature, and years passed. Having no one to speak to, he stopped speaking and instead adopted animal means of communication. Not just with wolves. Over the years, he approached other animals, including domesticated ones, since there were flocks in the mountains. But he avoided human contact for 11 years and resumed it only by force when he was captured. He no longer spoke, rejected clothes, and ate everything with his hands, and so he had to be re-educated before he was reintroduced into society. First, he was put under the care of nuns and a priest, who taught him the use of speech, which he recovered, because more than anything he needed to remember. He dressed again, walked upright all the time, and was transferred to another hospital in Madrid. This readaptation was a success, or so it seemed, and finally he was released as an adult. We were now in the late 1960s, and Spain lived the last years of Franco's dictatorship. The economy was catching up with the rest of Europe, and cities were growing fast. Tourism was booming, and it provided jobs for people with little education. So he was sent to Mallorca, where he lived in a hotel that he paid with his work. On the surface, he looked like a man like any other, but psychologically, socially, emotionally, his re-entry into society was very hard. He was repelled by the noise, by the crowd, and the smell of cities, making him constantly uncomfortable. He was also taken advantage of, because he didn't understand many things, such as how money worked. He lacked cultural sense after so many years far away from society, and could not understand all these non-verbal means of communication between people. So he constantly felt like an outsider. He still did military service and worked for a few years in the hospitality industry, but was unstable. He moved to Malaga in the south of Spain, and finally settled in Galicia, in the northwest of the country, in a village where he found protection and some tranquility under the care of a retired police officer that he grew accustomed to and ended up considering family. Marcos is now 76, and his unique life experience has inspired a movie, Entre Lobos, Among Wolves. He often gets invited to talk about his experience, and his case has been studied. Like for all cases of young humans separated from society for a long time, it raises many questions. Questions about socialization, interspecies communication, what is innate and what is acquired or cultural in human behavior, the formation of personality, and the wiring of our brains in our early years, human adaptability too. It touches on many disciplines: biology, sociology, psychology, ethology, that is to say, the study of animal behavior. But like for all the different stories I will tell you tonight, these cases are all unique and are never a perfect experiment. Some humans have been able to survive away from society and been adopted or accepted by animals. But all the ones we know of and are documented are examples of children who had already acquired some knowledge and skills before they were separated from human society. It is extremely unlikely, and no such case is known, that a newborn could survive with the help of animals. They cannot feed or take care of a human baby. The acceptance of a human child or a young animal from another species by predators like wolves is rare, and ethologists agree that it can happen only in specific circumstances. First, the adult animal has to live alone, not in a pack. And second, it has to experience the phase of maternal or paternal instinct that happens shortly after the birth of its offspring. This instinct may be temporarily amplified if it recently lost its youngs, either because they died naturally or were preyed on by another predator. In these very particular conditions, a wolf or a bear may adopt a human. But in any other case, and especially if it is not in the maternal instinct phase, the human will be seen as a prey to feed on, or a threat to avoid. In Marco's case, the wolf that accepted him probably did so because she had cubs and was conditioned to protect and care for them. Seeing that he was not a threat, the care instinct extended to him. But he was lucky, because in any other circumstances he would have just been attacked, or at best pressed to leave them alone. His case is quite exceptional. There are cases of interspecies adoptions or sociability. If the conditions are right, a cat can adopt ducklings, or a lioness an antelope, or a wolf a human, but these are very rare. the fact that he survived for more than 10 years has been attributed by all experts who studied his life as a combination of previous experience of nature when he lived with the shepherd in a cave, and also an intelligence of nature that was well above average for a child. He understood how he could find ways to feed, find shelter in caves, or approach wild animals. And he also probably had a lot of luck. He was lucky to find himself among a litter of recently born wolves, rather than at any other time. He was also lucky to never break a bone or get an infection. Any of these could have been lethal. The odds of survival in the wilderness are so low for a child that there are few examples of true, documented, feral children. And as I told you, all the proven ones are with young children that had been socialized before. Under this general term of feral children, there is a variety of situations. For example, children with disabilities who were abandoned by their parents and found shortly after still alive. Looking at historical records, there were also plenty of hoaxes or old cases that may have a true base, but were then amplified, or maybe entirely invented and became legends. I will tell you about some of these. And finally, there are fictional characters like Tarzan or Mowgli from the Jungle Book that were inspired by legends or real cases and expressed the fascination for this what if that feral children represent. What if an isolated human grew among animals? What if a child was never socialized but still grew into adulthood? This is what we are going to explore tonight. But before we go on, please take a moment to adjust your position. You can sit or lie down comfortably. And as always, do not hesitate to close your eyes and let yourself go if you feel sleepy. You can always come back later and resume the story. There are timestamps to help you with that, and if you look at the description or the comment pinned under this video, you will find links to audio streaming sites and Patreon. These are other alternatives to listen to my stories. You will find them on Spotify, Apple Music or Amazon Music and other sites. And on Patreon, you can listen to them as podcasts, with or without background sounds. Patreon is the place if you wish to support this channel and contribute to keep it free of ad breaks. It also gives you the possibility to download all audios and videos to access them easily offline. And now, let's resume tonight's story with another case, one that will take us to 18th century France and the extraordinary destiny of Marie-Angélique Blanc, also known as the Wild Girl of Champagne. She is notable not only for the time she survived alone in the forest, more than 10 years, but also for her intellectual rebirth and adaptation after she returned to society. A French society of the 18th century she was not even born into, because most of this story happened in France, but it began in America, in present-day Wisconsin. Marie-Angélique was a Native American girl from the Fox people, born around 1712, and in circumstances that are unknown, she became attached as a child to a French lady who lived in Canada, possibly as an adoptive daughter or a maid, we don't know. In 1720, as she was about 8 years old, this lady moved from Canada to France and brought her along. But the ship arrived in Marseille, in the south of France, where in 1720 a plague epidemic had recently burst. The whole region around, the region of Provence, was ravaged by this plague, and most probably her caretaker or adoptive mother died from it shortly after their arrival. The girl found herself alone, knowing absolutely no one, maybe not speaking the language, in a region plunged into chaos by the epidemic, and she escaped. We know nothing of her motivations. Maybe she was afraid of what would happen to her as an orphan, coming from another continent and culture, or she found the prospect of living in nature more attractive than staying with people. Maybe she had a couple of bad experiences with the people she met. But in any case, she chose, or was forced, to live on her own, in the forest. And a long period of 10 or 11 years began, during which she traveled a lot across France, always staying in forests and avoiding towns and villages. It was estimated that she walked thousands of miles during this period, which ended in 1731, when she was captured in Champagne, in the northeast of the kingdom. She never lived with wild animals, especially wolves that were still relatively abundant. Instead, she resisted them. She constantly kept a wooden club and a kind of artisanal spear, a long stick with a sharp metal tip that she probably stole somewhere. It is believed she lived on roots that she found underground, wild berries, food that she occasionally stole, and possibly little animals that she hunted. When she was captured in Champagne, aged 18 to 20, her body was very hairy for a woman. Her nails looked like claws, and her skin had become darker. All different signs of adaptation to the dangers and the cold of the wilderness. She was showing some characteristics of regression. For example, she knelt down to drink, and she had regular sideways eye movements, which is the result of living for a long time in a state of permanent alertness. She would switch posture and not always stand upright. Sometimes she walked on all fours. But she had also kept very human characteristics, like using these weapons or tools that she kept with her. And she readjusted extremely well and fast to society. Maybe because she had never lived among a group of animals, so she did not imitate their behavior, or because she had traveled a lot and had remained aware that she was like these humans that she regularly saw when she approached hamlets and villages. Like for Marcos in Spain, she needed to remember speech rather than learn it from scratch. But on top of that, she also learned to read and write, something that was not that common in 1730. In the following years, she became a nun. This sounds a bit random, but it was rather normal at the time for a young woman with no family, husband, or fortune. A short account of her life, like a little pamphlet, was sold in order to provide a small income for her. It is unknown how things went when she was a nun, but she finally left the convent and was rescued financially by the Queen of France, who awarded her a sum of money or a pension, and she even died relatively wealthy in Paris in 1775, aged 63. We know she was wealthy thanks to the inventory of her possessions, her goods, made after her death. Her story was mostly forgotten, only remembered by experts in the period, until it was rediscovered and became a subject of scholarly books and biographies since the years 2000. Now, the period when her story happened, the 18th century, is important here. The 18th century is also called the Age of Enlightenment for the intense activity of philosophers who questioned politics, the law, what the foundations of society were built on, the nature of man, and how humankind should organize. Debates were raging around questions like the nature of man, fundamentally good and corrupted by society, or bad and redeemed by education. Was life in contact with nature desirable, or should people manifest, express their humanity by living in man-made environments? Were men better off following traditions or experimenting with society? And many other lines of questioning that would shape political philosophy and its debates in the modern period. So, because it happened in the 1730s, and she lived until 1775, only a few years before the French Revolution, a case like Marie-Angélique's was looked at as a real-life experiment, made intellectually even more exciting by the fact that she came from America, and in the eye of some thinkers of the period, this could mean that she had not been corrupted by European society. It seemed she could fit into the archetype or the myth of the noble savage, a theoretical human being free from the influence of socialization. In reality, this is not really what the case of Marie-Angélique was about. She had been socialized. We don't know how many years she spent in her tribe, and then in the company of French colonists in Canada. But in both situations, she was inside a society. She had learned skills, she had developed behaviors and an understanding of the world before she started this wild life. So it is quite obvious that her story cannot be considered a clean experiment. It is more remarkable for its originality and the adaptation skills she showed during and also after these 10 years without human interactions. Even though it sounds very cruel and certainly unethical, in the 18th and 19th centuries there was this temptation of experimenting on children to better understand the influence of socialization, how language appeared, what was innate and what was acquired. And this could be one of the possible explanations behind a historical mystery that appeared in Germany in the 19th century, when a boy who seemed to never have been socialized suddenly appeared. This is the story of Kaspar Hauser. In May 1828, a teenage boy appeared in the streets of Nuremberg, Germany. He seemed lost and unable to say anything else than the words, "I want to be a cavalryman as my father was." And he carried 2 letters. One was by an anonymous author, presenting himself as the boy's caretaker, in which he explained that the boy was born in 1812, so he would have been 16 in 1828, and that he had been instructed in reading, writing, and religion, but never allowed to leave the house where he was kept prisoner. The second letter was apparently from the boy's mother to his prior caretaker, the supposed author of the first letter. And this second letter stated that the boy's name was Kaspar. It confirmed that he was born in 1812, and added that his father was a deceased cavalryman from a brigade stationed in Nuremberg. That was all the information. And the boy, Kaspar, would not provide anything else. The 2 letters that were supposed to be from 2 different people, his caretaker and his mother, seemed to be written by the same hand. Because he couldn't provide any other references or an address, Kaspar was imprisoned as a vagabond, and it was assumed that he may well be a wild child from the forests. He was not treated as a criminal, though, and could receive visits or walk out of his cell, staying in Nuremberg Castle, where he had been jailed. Various curious people started to visit him, and during this period at the castle, he seemed to learn things very quickly. He showed an excellent memory, and fed normally, even though he refused all food except bread and water. As apparently memories came back to him and his speech improved, he told one of his visitors about his past life. He said he had spent his life in solitary confinement in a dark cell with only a straw bed to sleep on. He claimed he found bread and water next to his bed when he woke up every day, and sometimes when he woke up, he saw that his hair and nails had been cut. The first human being he had ever met, he said, was a man who hid his face shortly before his release, who would have taught him to stand up and walk and write his name, after which he would have been released to Nuremberg. This tale aroused great curiosity, and brought much more attention to Kaspar, even though it seemed a bit hard to believe. You cannot quickly learn to stand up and walk at 16 if you have never practiced. And it was also suspicious that he had picked up speech at 16 so quickly, if he had never spoken to anyone for most of his life. Early on, there were allegations that he was an impostor, and that the story was completely invented. After all, maybe he had written these 2 letters himself, the 2 letters he carried with him when he was found were supposedly from 2 different people, but they had the same handwriting. But still, it didn't mean that he was lying. Another hypothesis was that he had been the subject of a cruel experiment to see how a child would grow up without socialization and education. The idea that such an experiment could have happened at the time was not absurd, because this idea, or this questioning, had been around for decades. And maybe there was something of this in his childhood. But this is completely unproven. And given what we now know of cognitive development, neurobiology, or physical development of children, it seems impossible that he stayed confined for 15 or 16 years and could speak, walk, or even just communicate only a few weeks or months after release. Another rumor arose that he may well be of noble parentage, and he would have been kidnapped and kept in isolation for a sinister dynastic or inheritance plot. The theory that he was the hereditary prince of Baden began to circulate months after his appearance in Nuremberg. The reason for the existence of this rumor may well have been just a coincidence. A child was born in September 1812 in the Baden family, only to die, officially, a few days later. This child, a boy, was the only direct male heir to the Grand Duchy of Baden. And because the law was that the Grand Duchy had to be passed to a man, the next in line became the Grand Duke's brother. So the child's death was obviously advantageous for his uncle, the brother of the Grand Duke. It made him successor to the throne. So, in summary, this 19th century conspiracy theory was that the rightful heir, maybe Kaspar, had been kidnapped and replaced with a dying infant looking about the same. This anonymous infant would have died, as expected, a few days later, making everyone in the line of succession gain 1 place, especially his uncle. On purely theoretical grounds, this theory could work, but there was never any proof. And would conspirators really be just wicked enough to steal a child, replace him with a dying one, and keep him secluded for 16 years, but not wicked enough to just poison the rightful heir or kill him? That sounds a bit hard to swallow. But still, the rumor persisted. And it only grew with alleged murder attempts that targeted Kaspar. Alleged because, weirdly enough, there was never any witness. and the conditions of these attacks were a bit suspicious. In 1829, a year after he had been found, Kaspar was found bleeding from a cut on the forehead in the cellar of the house where he lived as a guest. He claimed that a hooded man had attacked him, but a blood trail around the house showed that Kaspar had first fled to the first floor of the house where his bedroom was, and only then, instead of calling for help and trying to find his caretakers, he had gone to the cellar through a trapdoor. It almost looked as if he had self-inflicted this wound with a razor before taking it back to his room. And then he would have gone to the cellar without realizing that this blood trail would betray his moves after the wound. At this point, his caretakers did not want him anymore, and he was transferred to the home of another family, where relations also soured quickly. Another incident happened there, an alleged accidental shot that wounded him to the side of the head. But here again, he was alone when it happened, and people in the house quickly suspected that he had fired a bullet voluntarily to hide that this wound had another origin, possibly a quarrel he had gone into because he had been confronted for lying. This accusation of lying a lot and about anything was something that came back regularly in the different families that housed him, and it raised suspicions that he was an impostor indeed. And finally, in 1833, 3 years later, he came home with a deep wound in his breast. He claimed that a stranger had stabbed him in a garden. Many authors believe that this wound was also self-inflicted in a bid to revive public interest in his story, which was fading at the time. But he would have injured himself more deeply than planned, and 3 days later he died, aged 21. Supposedly aged 21, because after all the only indication of his birth in 1812 came from these letters he carried when he was found, and he may well have written them. Still, this murder attempt, if it was one, could be coherent with the theory that he was the rightful heir to a throne, from Baden or another one. And for the rest of the 19th century, this remained a historical mystery that fascinated in Germany and abroad. In 2002, DNA tests were made using what was thought to be his shirt stained with blood to compare the results with the DNA of a descendant from the ruling family of Baden in the 19th century. But the results were inconclusive. So Kaspar Hauser may or may not have been a wild child who grew up isolated. Maybe he was just an imposter looking for attention. But his real origin, his family, where he came from, all of this could never be traced. Speaking of alleged feral children, there are many along the centuries, and some of them were debunked in Europe, in Asia, or they are not substantiated enough. For example, in Lithuania in the 17th century, there were 3 stories of 3 different boys allegedly raised by bears that became legendary. But archives strongly suggest that it probably never happened. There are different stories from the 20th century of children raised by dogs in Ukraine, in Russia, Chile, Romania. But rather than actual wild children, these appear to be more sad stories of children abandoned in the streets, or who escaped their family and survived in cities, in the company of stray dogs. Another case that raised suspicions and is based only on the declarations of one person is the story of Marina Chapman, a British woman born in South America. She claimed that as a child, she was taken from her village in Colombia. She would have been too young to know the name of the place, and then released alone in the forest. There, she would have spent the next several years following capuchin monkeys, which are small New World monkeys known for their intelligence, until she was rescued by hunters. The story does not end there. She would then have been sold to a brothel, lived on the streets, became a slave of a mafia family, before escaping, being sent to Bogota, and later to England as a nanny. This is how she would have arrived in Bradford, England, where she still lives today. She would have been born sometime in the 1950s. She made her story known through an autobiography that got published, but only after several publishers rejected the manuscript, because they thought it may well be inauthentic. There is no evidence that she is lying. It is just that the story sounds a little plausible, especially the part where she survived alone with monkeys in the jungle for years and recovered perfectly normal cognitive abilities without any kind of treatment or re-education after this. Another dubious story, and this one was most probably a hoax, was that of Amala and Kamala in India in the 1920s. 2 girls allegedly raised by a wolf family. The original story became known and promoted by a single source, a clergyman, who ran an orphanage in Midnapore, west of Calcutta. In 1926, he published an article saying that the 2 girls had been given to him by a man who lived in the jungle. Later, his story changed, and it became that he had rescued the girls himself from the wolf's den. Amala was about 8 years old, and Kamala 18 months, and everything indicates that they did exist. But it is believed that they were just disabled, and that their behavior was not the consequence of having lived with wolves. The clergyman claimed that they had anomalies like sharp teeth or nocturnal vision with an intense blue glare emitted by their eyes at night. But the medical doctor of the orphanage denied this. This clergyman also allegedly wrote a diary to follow and describe how the 2 girls were adapting to life with humans. But it was later revealed that this journal had been written in the 1930s, years after they had died. So it could not be authentic, and there are several more discrepancies like that. But in the 1930s, when this case became public, it attracted a lot of attention internationally, and it is believed it was the real goal, to raise funds for the orphanage that was desperately in need of funding to keep existing. There are different other hoaxes of the same kind, but separated from them, there are also mythical, legendary wild children, and also fictional characters. It dates back from antiquity. The mythical founders of Rome were Romulus and Remus, two twins adopted and fed by a she-wolf. Actually, historians and ethnologists have noted that the narrative of young humans raised or adopted by wolves was a widespread archetype in ancient Indo-European cultures. This type of stories keeps coming back from Western Europe to India. And stories with that same starting point could be found in places very far apart. They may be grounded in true cases during prehistory. At the time of the Neolithic, wolf populations were widespread around the world, and wolves were very abundant. The different species of wolves were the main competitors to humans to dominate the land in many regions of the world. So this was based on life experience, and maybe more deeply, there was a particular appeal in stories that questioned what part of humanity was animal, natural, or cultural and based on civilization. This question keeps its appeal, and it is probably one of the reasons of the rise to fame of fictional characters, like Mowgli from the Jungle Book or Tarzan. Mowgli in the Jungle Book, which was published in 1894, is a feral child from India, raised by wolves, who participates in adventures involving many other animal characters, which obviously are depicted as animals, but they are human archetypes in an animal form. The author, Rudyard Kipling, was born in India, and much of his work was inspired by it. Mowgli was possibly inspired to Kipling by a true feral boy, Dina Sanichar. In 1867, this boy was discovered by a group of hunters in the state of Uttar Pradesh, living among wolves in a cave. These wolves probably accepted or tolerated him because he had met a she-wolf with newborns a few years earlier. He was placed at an orphanage, and when he arrived there, he allegedly did not stand up. He walked on all fours and ate only raw meat. He would also not speak and only make sounds similar to a wolf. He went on to live among humans for over 20 years, until he died from tuberculosis in 1895. But he always stayed seriously impaired. He never learned to speak, probably because he had been separated from humans at an early age, before he ever learned, contrary to other cases I told you about before. Another famous fictional character, this one created a bit more than a century ago, is Tarzan. Tarzan is the creation of an American author, Edgar Rice Burroughs. In his original story, Tarzan was the son of a British lord and lady who were abandoned on the coast of Africa by mutineers. His mother died when he was an infant, and his father was killed by the leader of the ape tribe that adopted Tarzan. So he became a feral child, but prospered in the jungle and lived many adventures that were published along the 20th century. To conclude this little overview, let's talk about another true case of feral child, one of the most famous, the story of Victor de l'Aveyron, a French feral child who lived 200 years ago and whose study and attempts at re-education helped to break new grounds in the care and education of mentally delayed people. Around 1794, a boy began to be sighted in the woods near a village in the south of France. He was not aggressive or threatening, he was alone, but his presence intrigued the villagers, and this situation lasted for a month, until 1797, 3 years later, when he was spotted by 3 hunters. He tried to run from them, but they were able to catch him when he tried to climb the tree, and they brought him to town. He didn't speak. His movements were chaotic. They seemed to lack coordination. And he was placed under the care of a widow. At her house, he refused to eat anything but raw vegetables, or vegetables he cooked himself. Villagers estimated his age to be around 10 to 12 years old. But no one could identify him, no one claimed him, and soon after he escaped and returned to the woods, where he was spotted again periodically in 1798 and 99. Finally, in 1800, he was captured again and sent to an orphanage. We were at the time of the French Revolution. Napoleon was quickly climbing the ladder that would make him emperor a few years later. And with the intellectual context I told you about before, the Enlightenment, the myth of the noble savage, this questioning about human nature and what there was to it independently from education, all of this meant that there was interest in the case of a boy that seemed to have grown up separated from society. He was seen as a curiosity, and there was no shortage of theories to explain his state and what he would be able to become with education or not. Eventually, he was placed under the care of Jean Itard, a young medical student who adopted him into his home and published reports on his progress. This is where he received his first name, Victor, because it was never known which name he received at birth, or even where he was born, and Aveyron is the region where he was found. His caretaker, Itard, believed that 2 things separated humans from animals: empathy, the capacity to feel or understand what another person is experiencing, and language. He wanted to civilize Victor, who still did not speak, by teaching him to speak and communicate human emotions. It had been believed at the beginning that he was deaf and mute, but no, he realized he could hear, but he used this sense of hearing only as a mean of self-preservation, to be warned of the approach of a threat or of the fall of a wild fruit. Part of his education was to make him understand that the sense of hearing could also be used for communication. But he never really got there. At an early stage, Victor showed signs of quick progress. He understood what was said to him, even though he did not speak at all, and he learned to read simple words. But soon the progress stopped, and he always stayed at a rudimentary level and never spoke. So this education had mixed results, but in the process, Itard developed methods and protocols that turned out to be new approaches to pedagogy and psychology. He is considered one of the founders of oral education of the deaf. Not that Victor was technically deaf, but he had to learn to speak without realizing that the sounds he produced would be heard by others as a mean of communication. Itard also helped establish the first behavioral therapies or education strategies for impaired children, and gave a place to special education, because until that point, the education of delayed or impaired children was not looked at with a different approach. There were no specific protocols or ways of teaching and stimulating them. The case of Victor also contributed to change the way people looked at the association between language and intellect. A widespread belief in the 18th century was that language and intellect were actually the same thing, that they always came together. So mute children were considered impaired. The different possible causes, the reasons why they didn't speak, were ignored, starting with deafness, and they often ended up neglected, unstimulated, and indeed mentally delayed because of the lack of care in their education. This had begun to change a few decades before Victor appeared, and Jean Itard knew very well the new theories and education methods from the second half of the 18th century that used intellectual stimulation and the teaching of sign language to help deaf and mute people to be part of society. He didn't try to teach him sign language, but always kept a patient and a soft approach to his education. After a few years, it appeared that Victor would not progress further. He could understand simple conversations. He had learned to dress and eat with cutlery, but he would never speak or write or be able to become completely autonomous. Ulterior authors have argued that other hypotheses could explain Victor's state. One was that the boy could have developed a mental or psychological disturbance at a young age, and this could also explain his abandonment. When he was found, there were many superficial scars on his body that were attributed to his life in the woods. And this is well possible. But another possibility is that he was victim of mistreatment and escaped or was abandoned because he was different and his parents did not know what to do with him. An element in favor of this theory is that he showed symptoms of mental troubles that were not present in other feral children, like grinding the teeth, a tendency to rock back and forth, and sometimes sudden spasmodic movements. Another hypothesis is autism. Accounts of his behavior could point to a degree of autism that would explain his difficulty to communicate and display or understand emotions, like the people around him. These symptoms could also explain possible abuse, and that he was treated like an animal in his earliest years, leading to irreversible damage to his development. The importance of these first years has been strongly reevaluated along the 20th century, and we now know that a child that has not been nurtured until at least the age of 5 or 6 will probably have problems in their intellectual and psychological development. The different cases I told you about tonight tend to illustrate this. Feral children who somewhat successfully returned to society and acquired or recovered abilities like speech and an understanding of nonverbal communication are the ones who started this life away from society after the age of 6 or 7. If by chance and despite the odds they survived, but were cut from humankind earlier than that, they remained severely impaired for the rest of their lives, with or without possible additional mental pathologies. Or at least, this is what all the known documented cases tend to suggest. The case of Victor inspired different novels and a film in the 1970s, The Wild Child. This fame probably comes from the fact that this particular case is very well documented by multiple witnesses and archives. But like all cases of feral children, it keeps a lot of mystery. We don't know where he came from, what his life alone in the woods was like, or in what mental world he lived after such a life experience. Victor died of pneumonia in 1828, aged approximately 30. We have reached the end of our story. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library if you don't feel like sleeping yet. I will be back soon with a new one, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.